Hello and welcome back to the IPA's Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. This week we'll be looking at proposals from Christian Porter, the Attorney General, to treat social media companies as publishers. Will this punish Silicon Valley lefties running these companies, or will it be an Armageddon for conservatism? That's one of the things we'll be talking about today. Then we referee the Westpac versus Austrac bout, which may have actually claimed the CEO of Westpac. Try to get to the bottom of that. And then also elder statesman of the Liberal Party and conservatism, John Howard, has said that perhaps the party's over, or at least political parties are over as social institutions. We live in an age where people aren't joining, so we'll look at that as well. And then in our regular books and culture segment, we have our panellists have got some rippers today. We review the documentary, The Rise of Jordan Peterson, screening now. We have a new book on the sorry state of our universities. It's season 3 of The Crown. And then there's a classic movie which launched the career of Michael Mann. And I don't want to trigger any climate skeptics out there. It's Michael Mann, the director, not the guy who came up with the hockey stick. So it's time now to introduce my panellists. First of all, my co-host from RMIT University, Chris Berg.
G'day, Scott.
Good to have you. On my right, appropriately, is Andrew Bushnell.
Cheers, Scott.
Research fellow at the IPA.
It's a little political dig.
Always the right most.
It's it's okay at the IPA. And of course, our national manager of Generation Liberty, Renee Gorman.
Thanks for having me on.
Great to have you back. As I mentioned, we have on the podcast before talked about the ACCC's investigation into digital platforms, and now, Chris Berg, there's been a recent intervention from your good self.
Well, there has been. The intervention originally was from the Attorney General, Christian Porter. So Attorney General Christian Porter has argued that social media networks, as you said, should be treated as publishers rather than sort of platforms. We're talking, of course, about networks like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, potentially the podcast platforms that we all rely on. Specifically, he's argued that they should be legally liable for defamatory comments made on their platform. So right now, if a defamatory comment is made on Twitter, the person who made the comment is liable, but the platforms are not. In this model, in the Attorney General's proposal, the platforms would also be liable for those comments because they are publishing them. So his argument is that we need to resolve an inconsistency between traditional publishers like newspapers and broadcasters and social media networks. Now, as you mentioned, I have a piece with Aaron Lane, our colleague, in the Sydney Morning Herald, published on Tuesday, which we argue that this policy is fundamentally confused. It's fundamentally confused about the distinction between digital platforms and traditional publishers like newspapers, and the common law has recognised that difference. And you know, this may change over time, but the idea that there would be legislation to override that, some of the fundamental differences. So, for instance, a fundamental difference between social media and newspapers. Newspapers commission articles, they edit articles, they hopefully fact check articles, they know who is publishing on their quote platform. They have an editorial voice. Social media has none of these things. Social media doesn't even check if you are a real human and not a robot, or doesn't tend to check beforehand. This has a practical effect. So if we insist that digital platforms have to take liability for everything that's published on them, they are going to take absolute responsibility. They are going to delete anything and everything that they could potentially see as the most marginal risk, and the most marginal risk against, their interpretation of what their interpretation of what Australia's most left-wing judges think Australia's anti-free speech law could possibly be. And that's why I think, finally, this could be a devastating policy, particularly for the conservative movement, because it is the conservative movement that has relied most on the new digital platforms, the end of the media gatekeepers, or the end around the media gatekeepers, the ability to speak directly to your audience without having to go through Australia's newspaper conglomerates. I think, if anything, if you could try to think of a policy that would more effectively destroy the conservative movement online, I think you would come up with what the Conservative Attorney General Christian Porter has. Andrew, we've been discussing this for a while, and we've had a lot of conversations about the ACCC and Facebook and social media and the way we should think about it. What is your take?
I think, firstly, just as a factual matter, I think that the bill proposes, while it proposes to extend the application of defamation law, it also proposes that the states get together to weaken defamation law by introducing a new protection for media companies in the public interest. So I think that does need to be understood, that that Porter, I think, understands that extending the scope but leaving it as it currently is probably not going to lead to the best result, but he thinks that he can build in a sufficient protection for those companies. But I think that the more interesting question around this is whether it's incredibly naive to believe that social media companies do not have an editorial position. Now, it seems obvious that they have an editorial position because they curate their feeds algorithmically and with teams of people. They have rooms full of actual physical humans who make human decisions about what goes up on their platforms. And they should, by the way, because the idea that we should be laissez-faire about Facebook live streaming mass murder, I think is ridiculous. I think they should curate this content. But as soon as we admit that, and as soon as we admit that they have the capability, and we know they do. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that something like Twitter doesn't have just one editorial position, although at the top level, it's very clear that it does. It's very clear that it already takes steps to maximise favoured voices and minimise voices it doesn't like. But also in another sense, at a kind of lower level, it has millions of editorial positions because it curates your feed personally. And it's doing that deliberately. So the question is whether, and particularly under Australian law as it stands, the question is whether that capability makes them publishers anyway. So this law, I think it's a little bit misleading to think that this law is completely innovative when we know that the common law is trending towards recognising them as publishers anyway, which is what happened in the New South Wales Supreme Court in July with the Voller decision.
But isn't that the entire case? So there's obviously a circumstance, and we'll bring you in a sec, Renee, sorry. There's obviously a circumstance in which a platform that makes no judgments, it increasingly makes more and more judgments, and eventually it becomes a newspaper. So there's obviously, there's a point in time in which if you're making more and more editorial calls and so forth, that eventually they're a newspaper. But that is for the common law to decide, and potentially you might be right. The common law might be moving in that direction. I think that New South Wales case is slightly more complicated, but the common law might be moving in that direction. Why then do we have the Australian federal government deciding to write a law that is clearly in the interest of one particular segment of the press? It's clearly in the interest of the newspapers that resent the loss of advertising revenue to the digital platforms. Why are we asking the Commonwealth Government to do that? Renee, I might have you answer that real setup of a question there.
No, I just
deeply unfair of a question.
I think, they're going about this entirely the wrong way. What we have here is an issue of exactly what Andrew was saying. There is a level of curation, and a level of curation that definitely affects conservative voices over left-leaning or centrist voices. But this seems like something that needs a scalpel job just to fix it, and we've got a sledgehammer out and we're going to completely mess it up further. I think something that would help both sides is that A, more transparency about how that curation works from these companies, and B, a very clear set of rules and laws defined by these companies about what they take down and why they take it down. Because we see one of the biggest issues around censorship on the internet is that the rules aren't clear to anyone, and that videos can be demonetized or pages can be taken down, and they don't really know why, and you also don't know when you're putting something up whether it will be taken down. So an evening across the board of rules So everyone's on an even playing field seems like a much more reasonable way of going about this, rather than going into defamation, even though I do believe the part about looking into defamation law in Australia is actually a very intelligent point, but I don't think expanding it to social media is going to be a good move, especially for Conservatives.
Yeah, I mean, this is, and Christian Porter has some recent form in this. I mean, he is a classic Attorney General who believes in the power of law reform to affect change in the way that he would prefer. But we saw recently in the case of the foreign interference laws, where the very first investigation that we're aware of was not into a Confucius Institute or a Russian agency or anything. It was Andrew Cooper in the CPAC conference, and Christian Porter had the classic response, which was, "Oh, well, that's not what the law was designed to do. I shall have a stern talk to my department." So this is
not what it was intended to do, which is just the saddest thing.
Yeah, not what it's intended to do. And as I think it was the US Supreme Court judge who said something along the lines of the law is concerned not with what was aimed at, but who was hit. But here we are again. It's like, oh, don't worry. I'm doing this pursuant to an issue in competition law, but you needn't worry about its effect on free speech, because that would, that's not contemplated. That's not what we're trying to do. And the context is defamation. One of the key contexts is defamation law, and I have no faith in the idea that the state and federal governments are going to land on any position anytime soon. Like, that should be. I'm not even sure it's a sufficient condition, but it certainly should be a necessary one before you embark on this change. I've just been reading a piece we'll link to in the Melbourne Law School magazine about the history of defamation law. We have a tremendously restrictive regime in Australia. We have something like 3 times as many defamation cases as there are in the UK, which is a larger jurisdiction. Fewer defences. It's much more friendly to the plaintiff, and so to say, well, we'll change the law and don't worry, we'll get around to fixing defamation laws in due course. We'll get all the attorney generals from all of the states to agree. It's not something I can see happening.
No, defamation law is a serious problem, and one of the reasons it's a serious problem, and one of the reasons it's hard to reform, is because so much of the political class rely on using defamation law to buy themselves new swimming pools and to do renovations on their home. It's the history of defamation law in this country is abominable. So even if there was a principled argument for applying defamation law to the digital platforms, which I do not think there is, and I just cannot see how that argument functions, I think it would be a fundamental disaster to apply this terrible law. Hopefully, if we could get out of this, potentially we might be able to get reform to defamation law.
But so you're talking about a legal establishment that has a very long history of expanding the reach of defamation law. And the idea is that we should turn over the development of defamation law to those people. Now, to Renee's point about some sort of transparency or clarity around the way social media platforms operate, I think that's a good point, but it also requires positive law. One way or another, what this is going to come down to is whether we are willing to have government step in to clarify the situation. Now,
the last thing I want ever is for government to step in and clarify.
No. See, this is the fundamental naivety. You've just described a legal establishment that has a well understood path dependency.
No.
Only
So the story
in one direction.
The story about defamation law is the story of radical reform every couple of years in order to protect not the legal profession, although they obviously get a lot of benefit out of it, but to protect the political class. To your point, we have made policy decisions, not common law decisions.
No, you're both wrong. The constituency that's building for this, and this is what is actually of extra concern, the constituency that's building that we've been covering is, and you raised it at the start, it's about public interest journalism. So I read this piece from my alma mater, Melbourne Law School, a couple of degrees there, thank you very much.
You didn't go to Oxford or anything.
And of course, if I do that. But the point is, what they're interested in fundamentally is the impact of defamation laws on journalism. And they're trying to have, so what they're saying is we'll have a wretched defamation law, but there'll be carve-outs, there'll be defences
No,
for
I'm not-
public
I'm not
interest
saying that-
journalism,
I'm not
and that
saying
is
that-
not a fix.
I'm not saying that defamation law as it stands is a good thing. I think it should be significantly narrower. And I also don't buy anything that the journalist lobby says about itself, because I don't believe that freedom of speech exists for the pursuit of truth. I think it exists because mouthing off is one of the fundamental
Makes
goods.
us
Great
human.
joys of life.
Yeah, it's one of the-
We want to
exactly.
maximise
It's one of the-
happiness.
It's one of the low-cost joys. That's basically my view of it. But hence podcasts like this one. But I think that what it comes down to again is that there is going to be some reason for positive law to be made, even if it is just to establish that social media companies are different from other publishers and to make that clear. I also take issue with the idea that social media has been good for conservatives. I do not see this at all. It's been very good for Trump, but he was already famous. It's not particularly good for conservatives because of the larger dynamic of what social media represents, which is an opportunity for people to essentially construct a reality within which they live together, completely impervious to reality. And so I think that to the extent
I
that
massively disagree.
to the
Yeah,
extent
no,
to the extent that progressivism is a constructivist fantasy, which is true, right? So to the maximum extent, then social media, because it aids that, is necessarily biased against conservatism, which is a realist project and is about directing people towards something that is true and not letting them cocoon themselves in lies.
I have
Renee.
to. No, I massively, massively disagree, because you're taking out one external factor there that you're not taking into account, which is that young people are consistently wrapped in a cocoon of leftism when they go everywhere else except social media. So they want any diversity of opinion, they have to go to the internet. And that's the only way that I meet young people these days where they've sourced their ideas is the internet. I really am of the belief that Generation Z is going to save us, that Generation Z is the most conservative generation since before the baby boomers, and there are studies out there that show that to be true, and that is because this is the first generation to not have a centralized source of information, as in they don't read the newspaper, they don't watch the news, they source all their own information independently. There was a recent study in the UK that 53% of people under the age of 19 identify as conservative or centrist. That is the most... that is like the highest it has ever been, and people only get more conservative with time. And we are seeing a backlash against the left on social media, as in we're seeing rises of traditionalism and people saying they're moving away from this kind of hedonism of modern times. And that's been built online.
Yeah, the stakes are. It's a fantastic perspective, because for someone of my generation who grew up, with where official media essentially curated the opinions for you, and it was very hard to get access to alternative opinions. We're a little bit like you can look at social media and say, well, here's this thing that's new and it's opened up, and you can argue about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's certainly something that happened. Whereas the generation you're talking about has grown up entirely within that milieu. So imagine the stakes for them in this kind of thing about getting this wrong. If we do regulate social media out of existence, what's left?
And it's also, I think, one of the great things about this generation not having a centralised form of information is they're continuously suspicious of any authority that's trying to control information. Even though you can say that their Facebook feed or their social media feed is curated and they're living in a bubble, social media and the internet are tools, and they get to choose what to do with it.
Is that a topic of discussion, that this awareness that it's curated, that there might be an editorial slant, if you like, for want of a better word, Twitter, Facebook, other platforms? Is that because knowledge is power? I mean, if you understand it, then you can compensate for it. Is something that are they naively accepting their feeds, or are they taking active steps to manage it?
I would say that most young people are aware that their feeds are curated, but you also got to remember that they're curated to the things that you've already been searching. So it's not like they're naturally curated to the left. If you've been searching Milton Friedman you'll get a think tank related to him coming up on your feed.
Their interest is to keep you on the platform so they can
Yeah.
sell ads. I mean, that's.
I don't know. Twitter definitely gives you a little bit of spice. Like it'll show up.
Twitter's
on mine. It'll just put into my feed like blue drip morons.
Twitter's newsfeed is insane. I mean, the way and the idea that it is deliberately curated is a wildly overstating the competence of Twitter's algorithm designers. I do not want to read things that happened 12 hours ago.
No, but the algorithm itself disproves the idea of neutrality. But I think that there is a question here about whether it makes the right worse, social media, and basically that's because the true right, if you like, is not something that has this skeptical empiricist disposition that our society is set up to cultivate in people. And so the idea that you could ever have something that would actually amount to conservatism in practice when everyone is encouraged by every single institution in our society to individuate themselves, to be skeptical of everything that they're ever told, and then the flip side of that is to trust untrustworthy sources, which is what the internet is full of. I mean, a diversity of errors is still error, and that's essentially what the internet has cultivated.
It's a
You're
false
not a
dichotomy.
real conservative.
It's a false dichotomy because your choice is this, right? Your choice is the left liberal media of the 20th century with a monopoly, or the left liberal media of the 21st century plus a end around the gatekeepers. Now, we can use this as we see fit, and we, as in conservative, liberals, libertarians, should be as aggressively competitive in the market as we can, and that's why we run things like podcasts. That's why the IPA is interested in, we're sitting in this giant, beautiful studio that's specifically designed to use these technologies and use these platforms in the interest of the vision of the good world that we share.
I also think that you're letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, as in what do you advise young people to do, as in the internet has been such a good source for information and ideas which, the media and their schooling is not providing.
I would argue that my position is the realistic one, because we already have in the law, as a matter of positive construction, a whole lot of barriers to what you would consider to be a pure freedom of speech. Leaving those in place, which is what's going to happen, and insisting that the right alone is unable to use positive law to get what it wants, basically just rigs the game in favour of political change in a leftward direction forever. And I think that is the fundamental decision that the right has to make, and that's what the last 3 years has really been about, which is about whether we can in fact change the direction of our countries, or whether the idea is that we are stuck on this left-wing idea of progress forever, and that the law will only ever tilt against us. And I think that's the dilemma, and that's why the truth in postmodernism is that very often an institution that claims to be neutral is not, and buying into the idea that it is neutral is to lose.
That's a terrific note to end that session on. No, that's a very neat summation, and much to think about there, because we will be returning to this. And the truth in postmodernism. That's not a phrase you expect to hear.
It's almost a paradox.
Yeah, not something. Yeah, that's right. Innately, much more prosaically, we've seen yet another meltdown in the corporate sector. This time, it is Westpac that's under the gun. It's been targeted by the regulator Austrac for allegedly not doing enough about money laundering and dealings with nefarious customers. Chris Berg,
that's right, Scott. So Austrac alleges that Westpac has contravened the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorism Financing Act over 23 million times. Which involves
just 23 million. It's the lazy 23 million.
Look, if it was 25, I'd be concerned. In Austrac's view, they have failed to appropriately assess and monitor ongoing money laundering and terrorism finance risk involving money travelling in and out of Australia. The amount of money, they say, involves about $11 billion. The real headline story, though, is that some of the transactions they're looking at were related to child exploitation risks. They're looking very closely at apparently 12 customers, one of which was a child sex offender and appears to have continued to use their Westpac bank account or some Westpac product to continue to pursue child sex offences or something along those lines. Of course, it's very hazy right now because it's ongoing legal investigation at the moment. Now, of course, for the last couple of days, the press has been gunning for the CEO, Brian Hartz's head. Brian Hartzer was quoted we're recording this on Tuesday, he was recorded in the paper in the morning saying, well, at least it's not Enron or Lehman Brothers, we'll be able to ride this out. An hour after I read that, he was out, which is just not a great thing. So Renee...
It's a bit like when the football coach has the full confidence of the board.
So this is bringing out all the big guns in the financial press, and of course this is taking the Australian business community by storm. It's the scandal of the day. Renee, how do you think about this, the moral obligation of Westpac to surveil its customers like that?
I think I more interpret it as the shift of morals that we're seeing brought along by woke capitalism. As in, if you focus on these shallow surface issues and you can present yourself as being virtuous, that gives you an easy pass to get by day, but deep underneath that there is going to be lurking some serious issues that you haven't actually looked at, which actually are much more morally
so we should
problematic.
sorry to bump in. We should explain that. So John Roskam had a piece in the Australian Financial Review on Friday where he pointed out that Westpac has spent the last decade or so really parading itself as the ultimate in woke capitalism. It is a moral beacon of the Australian financial community, and in amongst having the moral beaconness, it's been doing this. I'll quote John. If you're a company like Westpac that parades its progressive social agenda credentials at every opportunity, you better make sure you're not accused of turning a blind eye and facilitating the funding of some of the most evil crimes imaginable. Andrew, is that a fair cop?
I just on this, I'm not sure that what I would say about this is that this is another tremendous embarrassment for Australia's banking sector and for everyone who wanted to believe...
sector that really can't take too many more embarrassments.
And it's an embarrassment for everyone who is inclined to ordinarily to defend them. And what I took from this was that basically it can't go on like this. That you defend them and then they basically continue to embarrass everyone. I think arguably the problem is that they've basically got a cartel. So to make the free market point is that they're a little bit insulated from competition, and so that they feel free to go off on various follies. That there's not a lot of scrutiny of their various practices, whether it's actually managing their business or whether it's some of the more decorative things that they do. They're not actually exposed to a significant amount of pressure. For me, the solution to this is that, on the woke capital bit, we need some basically right-wing shareholder activism. My view is, this is an empirical question, but the proof doesn't exist as far as I know. My view is that there's absolutely no evidence anywhere that's ever been done, even any market research that suggests that this social justice stuff is profitable. So first, I would like them to produce some evidence to that effect. But yeah, I think it would be good for their shareholders and for the rest of us if they would get back to their core function so that it wasn't quite so embarrassing for the entire country when it turns out that they really are as bad as our opponents say.
But I agree with that as a general principle, though. I do feel, though, that in this particular case, there's a difference between the outrage that was in the community during the Banking Royal Commission about the things that banks had actually done to customers, or insurance companies had done to customers, charging dead people for insurance companies, or supposedly calling in loans that actually could have been serviced. The traditional sort of things that banks get bashed for. What I observe in this Westpac case is an assumption of outrage, of confected outrage. I think this is exactly the sort of outrage that insiders feel. I mean, AusTrack, this is not something that individual community members actually deal with. It is not customers being ripped off. It is not the board signing off on nefarious practices. It is a failure of compliance. And as we know, there are already 80,000 different items that require compliance in financial services, 10,000 bits of legislation, 10,000 bits of regulation, and another 60,000 items in soft law. So a failure of compliance is not always a moral failure.
Yeah. Isn't this how they like it, though?
Yeah,
I mean, the banks.
But that's my point. So it becomes a...
Sorry.
But also then by playing that game, you then have these morality plays being run where there are literally so-called investor analysts who are supposedly there to talk about the share price and examine the value of companies and talk about how are they creating values, who are literally saying things like, look, Hearts is going to have to go. That's the only way this is going to be solved. So they're not interested in whether the CEO was actually deficient in his responsibilities or whether there was a moral failure. It's just like, the PAC's baying.
They want an iconic head on the top.
We better throw the CEO under the bus.
So
it's ridiculous.
Andrew's made a really interesting point because, and I want to tackle anti-money laundering laws specifically, because the anti-money laundering counter-terrorism financing framework is one of the extremely large bureaucratic regulatory regimes that we impose on the banks that in part makes them less competitive. And one of the reasons that I say this is just doing some of the research on this for the podcast this morning. You come across the investigations that the government is making about whether to impose these same rules on lawyers and accountants and every other affiliated profession as well. And of course, guess what? The banks would really like that because it's an incredibly burdensome, it is a classic example of red tape, because what the government has done with these laws is handing off the enforcement of its own laws against bad things. Obviously, these are reprehensible crimes, but it's handing off the enforcement and prevention of those crimes to businesses through regulation.
And specifically to certain employees within those businesses. So it increases the cost of hiring people for these positions because the law increasingly holds individual persons criminally liable for certain things. And in fact, there's an inquiry early next year, I can't remember who's running it, into corporate criminal liability. I got the email asking for a submission. And Chris, you might recall, Chris, the red tape book that you and Darcy Allen put together. I had a chapter about corporate criminal liability in that. And I think, but to get back to the point, I mean, I think that the reason that's an issue is that, as you say, the more that the law attaches criminal liability or even just individual liability to people within these companies, and in particular within banks and this topic, what it's actually doing is outsourcing policing as well to the company. And we know there was a Deloitte or KPMG, I'll try and find it for the show notes, but there was a study a few years ago that said that 1 in 6 Australian jobs is in compliance, whether public or private compliance. So I think that there is a point, but again, I think, I'm not opposed to trying to make banks not funnel money to
no, but they're not funneling the money.
Crimes.
To clarify, they're not. They are accused of being insufficiently surveilling their customers.
And this is the problem. Sorry to go back. That there is a kind of constructive injury part of this, where our criminal liability within a company is actually determined by whether your internal governance standards were reasonable or not, and so it's not actually a direct. It's not a direct governance issue. It's a structural issue, and then they determine whether your standards meet their standards, and that of course creates again this compliance burden.
Going back to Chris's point, I find it very difficult to feel sorry for the banks in this circumstance.
No, I'm not suggesting that we feel...
Especially because...
Shed a tear for the banks.
Shed a tear for the banks who have... are consistently protected by government regulation and consistently lobby for more regulation, and oh no, this particular bit of legislation and regulation is hurting us. They're realising that it's a double-edged sword. If they are going to be at all, if I'm going to feel sorry for them at all, then they have to go out and we need to lower regulation at all points. That would also help our competitors. And also, if you're going to hold yourself up as a moral arbiter and try and virtue signal to the rest of society and look how woke we are, look how wonderful we are, I think this is the perfect kind of medicine.
It's not actually protection, is it? I mean, there is an assumption. I mean, in corporate reputation studies, they talk about the sword and the shield, that you build your reputation through various virtue signalling measures. It buffs your reputation,
your social license,
and that provides a shield for occasions like this. I mean, one of the questions, Renee, is: does it really? Does it actually protect you from being accused of something like this?
No, I don't think it does, because it makes you. It's not. It's because of the particular virtue signalling that they do, which is kind of we're more woke than you, we are better than you. It's a patronising kind of morality. And also, I would say this is a problem with the standards of the left these days. It used to actually be really difficult to make the left happy with big corporations. You had to have better conditions for workers, you had to actually do systematic change, and that's how you would get the left to be happy with you. Now you just have to go, we've got a diversity officer.
But isn't it because it's more subtle? Because the individuals who make policy within banks and corporations, and the individuals who make law, they need to be comfortable in the same room together. The rooms where these decisions are actually made. And so it's more subtle. It's not that the massive advertising campaign insulates you against all public criticism. It's that your commitment as an executive to that agenda gets you in the room. It's the secret handshake, and now we're all buddy and we can pursue our materialist fantasy together.
So one of the things that is happening in Australia, of course, is exactly those sort of conversations. Our political decision makers, including those drawn from the centre right, are increasingly in that sort of insider frame. They're elected by or produced by political parties, but political parties aren't what they used to be, says John Howard.
No, that's right. John Howard gave a speech on what I'm going to call unrepresentative democracy. I'll quote him. Modern generations do not join organisations, they don't join political parties, they don't join churches, and they don't join services clubs or even sporting organisations in the numbers that used to be the case. And one of the implications of that is that the local branch of the Liberal Party, as he saw it in the 1950s, was infinitely more representative of its local community than is the case today. Now, this is a big problem for representative democracy in John Howard's views, because if we're building a more and more insular political class that doesn't represent the population that they purport to represent, then there's a huge legitimacy problem. There are affiliated problems with, expertise problems. The government is trying to regulate industries that it doesn't understand, and so forth. But it does. I think the more fundamental problem is the democratic legitimacy one. If we as citizens look at our parliament and don't recognise in ourselves or in them any part of ourselves, I think that creates a problem, doesn't it, Andrew?
I do. This is what I do agree with you. I mean, in the sense that. That political parties, as they stand, they've become so ossified, such a part of the system, that they're not really responsive to their constituents' needs, and that's part of what drives the alienation of people away. I would add that, as is traditional on this show, I would mention that, Scott, I think that was one of your best segues ever. To go from whatever I was ranting about to the next segment, I thought was incredible.
I've been feeling bad about interrupting all these segues.
I had to do it because I don't even know where I was at the end of that last segment. So, but I think the question here is around, to use what the left's description of it is, representation. The idea that our institutions ought to reflect, as much as is reasonable to expect, the population at large. And this is the challenge that presents. Is that it's from there that you go to things like a quota for 50% MPs being women, and actively seeking out a more diverse mix. And the question is whether you should take positive steps to secure that good, noting, as you say, Chris, that one of the advantages of having a representative group of people is that you can kind of be more secure in believing that your room isn't leaving out any relevant perspectives that you might want to consider, particularly from a political point of view.
Yeah, Renee, I mean, so I pulled up some figures from these are from March 2018, so they probably have changed slightly in between now and then. But for example, 10% of parliamentarians are former lawyers compared to 0.7% in the general public.
Really? Only that low?
I know.
I thought everyone had a law degree.
I was kind of...
the way things are these days.
Everyone has a law degree, not everyone practices.
19% are either former party hacks, union officials, political staffers, or lobbyists, compared to basically 0% of the population. As composed, so those are the overrepresentative groups, as opposed to the people who work in the trades. 0.4% of those in Parliament used to work in the trades, compared to 13.5% in the general population. Is this a problem? What would you do about it?
Of course this is a problem, but I think the identity politics aspect is actually a diversion. So that the political parties can go out there and say, we've got a program to bring in more women, we've got a program to bring in more ethnically diverse people, but that would somehow imply that these people, just by the virtue of being female, are somehow have different thoughts or are completely different in the way that they think. If they're just another party hack, I don't care. I wanted something that actually represents Australia in the diversity of opinion, not the diversity of your skin colour or your gender.
And the diversity of interest.
Diversity of interest.
To give the like a steelman version of it, the claim is not that that they have some sort of innate ability that is not present in other people, but rather that their lived experience is different from other people, and
it will lead to different policy conclusions.
Yeah, and I think that last bit is a bit of a jump. Yeah, actually,
but that's the claim.
But that's the claim, and I mean, to a certain extent, we all know that this is true. I do not know what it is like to live as a woman in this society. I actually don't know.
Or
that.
a tradie.
The question is whether the question is or as a tradie, or as anyone who's ever had anything other than a stare at a computer screen job. And that's true. There absolutely are limits to my experience. The question is whether those limits are relevant from a policy point of view. I think at least at the political party level, I think John Howard is right to believe that the parties are struggling to come up with responses to public needs because perhaps they're only listening to themselves.
So there's a
at least in part.
I wanted to ask Renee though, like we're assuming that John Howard knows what he's talking about, and bless him.
He was a lawyer.
Tremendous Prime Minister. But Renee, the assumption there is that we can read a lot into the decline in the membership of political parties. I mean, often it's said to be a measure of the apathy of a younger generation. I mean, how are people in your generation engaging with politics and political parties? Are they completely disconnected, or are they trying to find other means to get involved?
Well, to go down to the material level, there's no advantage of being involved in a political party these days. As in, you go back 20, 30...
No cash payments?
No, 20, 30 years, you could put your party experience on your resume and it would be something good to an employer because it wasn't this just outright hatred for Liberals. While I know a lot of young people right now, if they have anything mentioning that they've done anything with the Liberal Party, they're knocked out of retail jobs. So there is a lot more heat that they cop specifically.
Even retail jobs? You mean like working behind a counter?
No, a young girl who I know involved in Generation Liberty applied for a job at Cotton On. They said she was really good, enjoyed her energy, really liked her. Then they went down to the bottom of her resume and went, "Oh, you've worked within the Liberal Party." Oh, and then she didn't get a call back.
Oh, good Lord.
So there's a lot of heat to be copped by joining a political party these days, and not much gain for young people. But I think I might have to address the elephant in the room that there is a specific reason why John Howard was addressing this to a national party think tank. And that is because the Nationals are dead in New South Wales. for a multiple of policies that didn't represent their constituency. Like the Nationals are not going to get any seats back in New South Wales.
So at the state election, the Shooters, Farmers and Fishers Party
are going to take all their seats.
Well, they've already taken some of the last one. Yeah.
Controversial though it is, and I'm not going to say where I stand on this, the abortion bill played a large part because Nationals do not, people in national seats saw that every national member voted in favour of it and played a key role in getting it across the line, and that doesn't represent their areas.
So there's an interesting devil's advocate position, which I don't think I share, but is an interesting one, and I'm going to associate it with former IPA board member Michael Kroger. And his argument, I hope I'm not defaming him by saying that, but anyway, go through the podcast platform. So his argument has always been, well, we talk about the need for group representation, but politics is actually a profession. Like, it's a job. You can get skilled at it. You can get good at doing it. Why wouldn't you want people who've spent their careers focusing on building up those skills, becoming better at doing the functional representation of their electorates or their states? Why wouldn't you treat it as a profession?
I know, yeah, but Kroger and his then friend Peter Costello made similar arguments in this vein, but I think they were talking about people who'd come up through professions in which political action was part of the job. So if you had been a trade union leader, if you had been a barrister who was used to advocating in the interests of their clients, if you'd heaven forbid you'd worked in a think tank where your job was to undertake research and articulate policy positions, I think what's closer to representing what they were saying is, or farmers, say in the National Party, the farmers, because of the nature of the collective goods in which they were interested, be it irrigation schemes or back in the day the marketing schemes that the National Party set up, there was they used to call it agri-politics or agro-politics, depending on how involved they were at the time. I think they were talking about those sort of things can produce politicians who are more or less ready-made for Parliament, as opposed to just entering a political system as a staffer and then coming out the other end as a senator.
It's the kind of standing structure of the party that is the problem. It's not the idea that people might make a vocation in politics. It's that making a vocation in politics largely means being on side with the right people in an institution that is actually buttressed by legal protections and privileges. I think we mentioned this in our submission to the nationhood inquiry, that one of the ways that you would go about addressing the kind of issue that John Howard seems to be concerned about is by actually reducing some of those privileges and protections at law. I mean, in an ideal democracy, no such thing, of course, but parties should theoretically come and go as coalitions of interests coalesce in society, and then we supposedly get some benefit from stability in the party makeup, and this is what justifies public funding for parties and things like that. I'm not sure that that's true. I think that the best politicians, the ones who are capable of making it as a vocation, are going to their local constituents will support them. Like, the proof is in the pudding, basically, with politicians. In the same way that a comedian gets instant feedback on whether his joke was funny or not, so do politicians. And good ones survive, and at the moment, bad ones survive as well. And the survival rate is what needs to drop.
I have to say that my complete position on this, and this is my honest view, is that we should have sortition, and we should be randomly choosing the political class out of a hat. Basically, a random selection of politicians that will completely solve the representative, and I cannot see how it would be worse than what we have.
Renee, last word on this topic.
Well,
what wild democratic reform would you prefer?
What we're seeing is Liberals finally playing the game that Labor have been playing for a very long time and very well. So if you go back 20, 30 years, there were more Liberals who were small business owners, who were more representative of a diverse community of different professions. But Labor was putting their talent through union jobs, staffing, and they were training them to be very, very good at politics. And the Liberals started to notice that they were losing because Labor was training their talent and looking after their people, and Liberals weren't. So they just started playing the same game. And you do see it generally results in a lot of staffing, and that's simply because there's not as many think tank jobs or particular barrister jobs that fall into the realm of politics as there are union jobs available for young people involved in labour politics.
Yep, big questions there. So we have come to that part of the show which is our Books and Culture segment, where our panellists are going to share what they've been reading, watching or listening to. Who would like to kick us off?
I'll have a go first. So I've been watching the third season of The Crown. This is the season where Olivia Coleman is playing the Queen, taking over from Claire Foy, who was the actor of the Queen in the first 2 seasons. Olivia Coleman is an excellent actor who I greatly admire. It's a shame.
By the way,
Yeah.
is it like now in the British system, is it a requirement that you've already played a Queen before you can play the Queen?
No.
So Claire Foy played Anne Boleyn.
Yeah, no, it's a professional.
And Olivia Coleman played Queen Anne.
You get better at it
in the
over time.
favourite. Yeah.
It's a shame that this season is incredibly dreary. Princess Anne is the only real character with any spark. But the overwhelming impression that I have about this, and I think this is a very anti-monarchy show, because the overwhelming impression you get is that they are an extremely wealthy family who are just peripherally connected to world events, just on the edge. So, for instance, there's the Aberfan tragedy, which was a tragedy in Wales of a school that was... there was an avalanche, a coal avalanche, and they used this horrifying and powerful story to really consider the Queen's emotional range. That's the most important part of the story, according to The Crown. The moon mission becomes an opportunity for Prince Philip to look at his midlife crisis. The great moon mission, Man on the Moon. Finally, we get an opportunity to think about Prince Philip's and personal emotions. The British bailout by the US is an opportunity to consider Margaret's career jealousy of her sister. The Greek military junta is an opportunity to consider Philip's absent parents. It's just sad.
But isn't that just complaining that the show is about the royal family rather than about world events?
Well, no, but it shows. I mean, look, yes, but the impression of the show is that they are very peripheral to all the interesting things that happen.
The show always struck me as anti-monarchy, but sort of pro this particular Queen, in the sense that the first 2 seasons make her out to be very decent.
I don't know. There's a couple of episodes in the earlier seasons where I do think they strike her as like she's not that bright.
But, yeah, if you are monarchist or inclined that way, the show, for me, no one's going to. Here's a marginal opinion, but the show reveals moments where the Queen could have been a hero and decided not to be. So, for example, the Suez Crisis, which I think was in season 1 of the show, she knew how unstable Anthony Eden was when he decided to commit troops, and she could have said,
"You're out."
She could have said, "Look, it's my country, and you're not sending the military to do this. This is mad. You're a lunatic." But she didn't. And so anyway, if you're a monarchist, if you're inclined more to an absolutist view of the power, there are moments where you're like, damn, that was a missed opportunity. She really could have reasserted the authority of the crown.
Yeah, and that just basically her role as depicted in the series is to sit back and listen to politicians explain themselves, and to occasionally meet famous people. And now you could say it's the monarchy's role is a symbolic position to epitomise the sovereignty of the British Empire, but it doesn't really tell you that story. It just tells you that they're very marginal to all things, and they're also quite rich, and they have a soap opera style.
And it is
life.
getting worse. In the episode where Lord Mountbatten, who is Prince Philip's uncle, and was a figure in his own right in the UK, was supposedly out of spite interested in fomenting a coup. And installing a military junta just like they had in Greece. I mean, this is ahistorical nonsense.
Yeah,
I mean, he might have been.
Look forward to season 10 where they do Brexit.
In one of the episodes, of course, Charles becomes a Welsh nationalist or something. So he gives these statements about. There's an anti-colonial from a Welsh nationalist perspective vibe there.
After 800 years.
You have to admit, I watched the first episode and turned it off. because I also just felt it got a lot more woke this season, and when she's in the art gallery and talking to Prime Minister Wilson, and she's like, "Are you an admirer of art, Prime Minister Wilson?" He's like, "No, I like numbers. I'm an economist." That seems very inaccurate.
Nothing's more woke than an economist.
As hero. What have you been
true. watching
instead, Renee?
So right now I'm on a little bit of a tour. Well, I just went to WA to screen The Rise of Jordan Peterson, which is a Canadian documentary that has not been shown in many mainstream cinemas for reasons that I guess a lot of us can guess. But it's actually a really interesting story. So when the documentary makers went in to make this documentary, they were originally going to make this about Jordan Peterson and a native tribe, and it was supposed to be about carvings and ideas of mythology and all issues around that. And the transgender bill in Canada came through, so the documentary had to kind of change immediately. They realised they had to address what was going on, and also he became someone who was sometimes in the media, sometimes had a little slot on a Q&A like show discussing psychology, to a massive figure, and possibly the most popular public intellectual. I particularly like the documentary because it shows him more as a flawed human being. It shows his family life, him kind of struggling to come to terms with becoming a political figure, which he always didn't want to become. He says in the film, "I don't want to become the political opposite of neo-Marxism. I don't want to be the voice for that. I just want to talk about the truth, and I want to talk about psychology." So that's particularly interesting. It does get a little bit dragged out towards the end, but overall I do think it's a particularly good documentary. And we do have screenings coming up in Melbourne, and we actually have a Melbourne University screening on Wednesday this week, which is pretty much sold out, and it's in the Union Theatre, or the Guild Theatre, right at Union House. So it's right next to the safe spaces. So that's going to be an interesting screening.
You could well be triggered.
You could well be triggered.
They've asked for a trigger warning, so here it is.
They have requested that we consider trigger warnings just in case.
Isn't the title a trigger warning?
Yeah, just in case someone purchases a ticket, stumbles into the theatre, sits down, and doesn't realise all that time that this film contains Jordan Peterson.
If you believe that governments should have the ability to mandate the use of gender pronouns, you definitely will be triggered by any mention of Jordan Peterson.
The other trigger warning I'm definitely going to put up is trigger warning may contain traces of shellfish.
Very good. I've been reading a book actually over a period of the last few months, because I went to the launch of Campus Meltdown, the Deepening Crisis in Australian Universities, which is from the great team at Connor Court Publishing. It's a collection of essays put together by the editor William Coleman, who of course is a professor at ANU, and of interest to anyone who is deeply, deeply concerned at the state of our universities, and that is probably nearly everyone listening to this podcast. Henry Ergus does the foreword, just to give it a bit of context. Henry says, of course we need institutional autonomy in universities. I might challenge that, but he said, assuming that, but he said that institutional autonomy has also made them vulnerable to the pathologies which economists term principal agents problems, particularly when they enjoy secure funding and insulation from competition. Diagnosing these problems is at the heart of many of this book's essays, as indeed it is. It looks at, I guess, the decline of some of the disciplines, the decline of the very notion of a discipline, the fact that we talk about the idea of a university and about how that is being lost and transformed over time, the impact that has on academics, the rise of the administrative class, what it means for individual disciplines such as literature. There's a terrific essay which I've actually in the process of adapting for the next IPA review, from David Martin Jones, on how international relations has both taken over what used to be the study of political science at exactly the same time as instead of studying international relations, it's become a version of peace studies, more or less. The relentless march of postmodernism through the disciplines as well and truly taken over there. So there's 14 different essays there. It does canvass some policy ideas, including more competition, allowing other institutions to take on a greater role, other teaching institutions like colleges to take on a greater role and provide that sort of liberal arts alternative, which I would wholeheartedly support. But it's mainly about the diagnosis. But very well done to William Coleman and authors such as the great James Allen. We have Barry Spur, Alison Wolfe, Peter Drake, Ruth Williams, Stephen Chavura. So I recommend that to anyone who wants to know more about what's happening with our universities and is interested in coming up with ideas to do something about it.
My pick is somewhat different because I think last time I was on the show I talked about a classic 80s film because I've been watching favourites of mine when I'm up late with my baby son, and this one is an absolute classic. This is one I can just
great for 3 a.m.
Just recommend this to everyone.
Screaming
to seek
child.
this out. It was put out. There was a Criterion DVD put out a few years ago, so there's like a definitive edition of it. It's called Thief. It's from 1981. It's by the great Michael Mann. Again, as Scott mentioned, not hockey stick Michael Mann, but famous auteur Michael Mann. Anyway, but this is like this movie is it's got James Caan in the title role as the thief. He's a safecracker. The film starts with an amazing set piece that was where he's breaking into a safe that's so realistic that the police insisted that it be recut so that you couldn't quite see exactly how he'd done it because one of the consultants on the film was an actual safecracker. And so the film goes from there. But it's this great story that touches on, 1981, it's that transition period of where, dirty 70s became more hopeful 80s. So this is still, it's the 80s, but it's still that grimy 70s kind of cinema. Similar in effect to that, to the recent Joker movie, which is, I think, set in the same time.
Yep.
And anyway, so James Caan, gun safecracker, turns out throughout this story that he was state raised, institutionalized, in and out of prison. He has this dream. He's got a little a card that he's made with different images that shows his dream of a family, a home. This is his motivation in the film. He's trying to put together the life that he didn't have as a kid. And
bourgeois aspirations.
Yes, exactly. And basically what happens is he gets taken in by this crime boss who ends up ripping him off for the money that they make on this job, and he has to choose between, being an employee and getting this bourgeois life as an employee, or being the kind of loner that he's been trained to be by state institutions. And of course, this being a Michael Mann film, it ends.
Is that your
with
reading, or
tremendous
is that explicit in the film, or is this?
That's.
Or have you worked this out afterwards?
No, that's. Well, I've seen this movie a number of times, but that's the implication is he tears up his dream. He kicks his girlfriend and their adopted baby out of the house, and he says, "I'm not that man. I'm this man, this lone wolf. I'm nothing inside." And he talks earlier in the film about how his institutionalization as a child had sort of killed. He thinks it's killed something in him, but you see in the movie that it hasn't really. But this is a mechanism that he's devised to cope. And so the film is a really interesting story about, dare I say, about atomization, about how his complex interaction with the state in the absence of a family had turned him into this quite dangerous individual, whereas his only aspiration in life was the kind of white picket fence that everyone else has. Michael Mann film, so it ends with tremendous violence, but it's
that's all right then.
But it's stylish, score by Tangerine Dream. If you're a fan of synth music, you're a classic Michael Mann nightscapes like the night. He explained in an interview once, the night makes the film feel more claustrophobic by putting a lid on all the action. So This
Like
one,
Collateral,
like
which
last
is one
time.
of his best as well.
I wholeheartedly recommend this. This is an overlooked, genuine classic. This is not a B movie. This is the real thing.
Thanks for that, Andrew. You will, of course, find a link to that IMDb notes in our show notes, and heartily recommend that. You've been listening to or watching Looking Forward, brought to you by the IPA. If you're not already a member, please do go to ipa.org.au to see how you can join or donate and support this podcast and the many other podcasts and publications that the IPA makes. I'm Scott Hargroves. I'm editor of the IPA Review. I'd like to say thank you to our co-hosts and panellists, Chris Berg.
Thank you, Scott.
Renee Gorman.
Thank you.
Andrew Bushnell.
Thanks, Scott.
Great to have you. We'll be back with more Looking Forward next week.